I get Erev Shabbos, everybody. Welcome to Jerry's Parsha Ponderings, the resumption of. We took a little bit of a break here for a while, number of reasons, but let's jump right into it. As in previous years, I am dedicating this week's shir in memory of my father-in-law, Reb Menachem Bareb Yehuda Zechreina Levracha. Those of you that had the pleasure and honor of knowing him knew what a man he was, a man who survived the Shoah, who came to Israel in 1947, fought for the independence of the state, eventually rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel, a Sgan Aluf. And the famous line, when Ruchi and I got engaged, he said to her, well, now you're going to outrank me. Well, she goes, what do you mean? He goes, well, you're going to be an aloof. I was only a Sgan Aluf. So, but very appropriate. And I'm going to just spend a few minutes discussing something I heard last week from our Rav in East Windsor, in Congregation Taras Emes, Rav Aaron Gruman Shlita. And we have to take a look at how the Jews wound up in Egypt. Why? Because as in all things in the Torah, Masa Avot Siman Labanim. What happened to our forefathers is a foreshadowing for what will happen to the Jewish people throughout history. And as in, there are no coincidences. I always say, if you watch NCIS, Gibbs Rule, I think it's 31, right? There are no coincidences. Rabbi Gruman last week said, let's look at the word ghetto. Where does the word ghetto come from? So if you look in Merriam-Webster, if you look in Britannica, Wikipedia, of course you'll find out that the word ghetto is Italian, and it comes from the first ghetto was the Venetian ghetto in Venice. You can visit it today. There are great restaurants. In the Roman ghetto in Rome, there are phenomenal restaurants. Ruchi and I have been to Rome twice, and we stayed in the ghetto. Why? Because there's great food there. But and the ghetto was, the Jews were basically corralled into a certain area because they were not allowed to mix with the rest of the populace. We were considered second-class people, so on and so forth. And to a Jew, especially one who has relatives that perished in the Shoah, people who survived the Shoah, to a Jew, ghetto has a very negative connotation. We think ghetto, we think of the Umschlagplatz, we think of the Warsaw Ghetto, and I'll never forget standing on the train station, the Umschlagplatz, right outside the Warsaw Ghetto, where the Jews were shipped off to Auschwitz and Treblinka and other such wonderful destinations. But the ghetto began in Italy. Rabbi Gruman said, hold on a second. The ghetto actually began in Goshen. It began in Goshen. That was the first ghetto. And the Jews went down to Mitzrayim. Hashem told Yaakov Avinu, go down to Mitzrayim. He told Yitzchak not to go down to Mitzrayim. Yitzchak was a kadosh. He was a karbon. He couldn't leave Eretz Yisrael. Couldn't leave the Holy Land. But Yaakov, he said, in this case, you have to go down. Why? Because they're gonna Kito avat Mitzrayim kol ro'ei tzon. That Yosef told his brothers, tell Paro your shepherds. Shepherds were the lowest of the low in Egypt. They wouldn't eat with the Mitzrayim, right? You saw that they had to separate them. They won't even eat with a Jew. So they were separate, and that way they were able to stay together. And eventually, they had to get out. But they were separated, and if you look in last week's Parsha, we're going to discuss Vayigash and Vayechi. And the last words of Vayigash, the last pasuk, what does it say? Hold on a second, I'm going to pause for this one, because I actually want to read it inside. Last pasuk in Vayigash. Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen Vayeachazu ba Vayifru Vayirbu ma'od. The Bnei Yisrael, that doesn't... Yosef told them, tell Paro, lagur ba'aretz banu. We're coming just to stay for a little while. Ki ein mira latzon asher lavada. We don't have enough. There's no grass. There's a famine. The sheep don't have where to graze. We're coming for what? But what does it say? Vayeshev Yisrael. No, they dwelled in Egypt, like it says at the beginning of Parshas Vayeshev. Vayeshev Yisrael, right? That Yaakov wanted to dwell in Eretz Yisrael, but it says Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen Vayeachazu ba. They took ownership there. They took ownership there, and Vayifru Vayirbu ma'od. They became very multiple. Again, what that word is? They multiplied a lot. There were a lot of them, right? And these are very damning words. These are very damning words. And they were not supposed to Vayeachazu ba. They were not supposed to take inheritance. They were not supposed to take ownership in Mitzrayim. And we see and we'll see in a couple of weeks in Parshat Shemot how that ballooned out of control. Because initially the Jews were supposed to remain in the Goshen ghetto. But as always happens, the ghetto, it could start in Brooklyn, it could start in Warsaw. Warsaw, there was only one way out. But in other ghettos, in other places, what ultimately happens, we wind up intermingling. And we saw, like, even by Makas Bachoros, the Jews had to paint their doors with blood of the Karban Pesach. Not that God wouldn't know which is Jewish and which isn't, come on. But it was to show, no, we regret having done this. We want to get out. Rabbi Grumman continued, and he reminded me of a very similar incident that Ruchi and I experienced not too long ago, probably over 20 years. But Rabbi Grumman said he's had the schus to have his mother-in-law living with them for a number of months now, and the Rabbanit's mom is a survivor of 3 concentration camps. She was eventually liberated from Bergen-Belsen. And Rabbi Grumman was talking about the uprise in anti-Semitism in the United States lately. And she said to him very simply, I'll say what she said in Yiddish, Ich hab das gesehen. I've seen this before. I know how it ends. This is from a Holocaust survivor who was in Bergen-Belsen. A number of years ago, Ruchi and I were driving down Highway 9 in Lakewood with her aunt, who was then alive, her Aunt Tubsha, who was also a Holocaust survivor. And this is when Lakewood was just really starting to explode. Right, the McMansions were going up everywhere, and I was in Lakewood just this past week, and I couldn't believe, every time I go, I'm like, wow. You have strip malls that are completely from stores. Every possible luxury you could want. Right? Baruch Hashem. But Tubshi, when we were driving down Highway 9, Ruchi said, Tanta, I can't believe, look at these beautiful houses going up. And Tubsha looked at her, Ruchala, this is nicht git. She goes, Favos. She goes, Yiddish a Heisen of Goyish a Gassen. Ich hab das gesehen. She said, they're Jewish homes on Goyish streets. I've seen this before. I know this movie, and I know how it ends. Vayeachazu ba. So the Rav was saying, what do we do about all the anti-Semitism? Should we use legal means to combat it? Should we use the ADL and the American Jewish Congress and all, yes, of course. Should we move to Eretz Yisrael? Of course we should move to Eretz Yisrael. What's the shaila? Should you keep Shabbos? Should you keep kashrus? Should you move to Eretz Yisrael? That's the same question. But he ultimately just looked at the congregation and says, I don't know. I'll leave you all to figure it out. What do we do? So since Parshat Vayigash Vayechi, we're learning about Yosef HaTzadik, what Yosef went through. Why do we always read about Yosef on Hanukkah? Very simple. Yosef is a prototype. He was the favorite son with the royal beged, the coat of many colors. And then his brothers threw him into a pit, sold him down to Egypt. He's at the lowest. Then he's in Potiphar's house. He becomes the head of the whole geschichte over there. He's the head man in charge. The problem with the wife, Potiphar's not servicing the account, right? She tries to seduce Yosef. He winds up in prison. Now he's at the bottom. But then he's the head of the prison. Right, and then you had the whole thing with the baker and the wine steward, the Sarah Mashkim, the Sarah Ophim. He tells them, "I don't belong here. Get me out." They forget about him. Well, the Sarah Ophim wouldn't have mattered. Right? Off with his head. But the Sarah Mashkim forgets about him. Another 2 years in prison. Then all of a sudden, Vayigalach Vayechalech Semalosav Vayavo El Paro, beginning of Miketz, he's standing before Paro. In the blink of an eye, he's the viceroy of Egypt. Back at the top. But that's our story. That's our story. The Jewish history is a sine curve. We're up, we're down, we're up, we're down, we're up, we're down, and Baruch Hashem, hopefully this is it. But there's a lot going on in the diaspora that bears very, very close paying attention to. And Chachamim of Barosho. We have to see what's going on and where we are supposed to be and what we are supposed to do. While we're talking about Yosef, I'll leave you this week with his final words to his brothers, next week's Parsha. But you have to remember that Yosef, being the paradigm, the ups, the downs, he tells Bnei Yisrael, he tells his brothers on his death. His brothers, he was his brothers. He was the first to die, even though he was the second to youngest, because being a viceroy takes a lot out of you. Vayash ba Yosef es Bnei Yisrael leimar. Yosef pasuk before. Chav Dalid, pasuk Chav Dalid and Perek Nun and Vayechi. Vayomer Yosef elacha vanochi meis. I'm going to die, as we all will. Ve'elohim pakod yifkod etchem ve'e'ela etchem min ha'aretz hazot ela aretz asher nishba la'Avraham liYitzchak u'liYakov. Vayash ba Yosef et bnei Yisrael leimar pakod yifkod Elohim etchem v'alitem et atzmotai mizeh. What did Yosef... No one had it better in Chutz La'aretz than Yosef. I assure you. Nobody had it better in Chutz La'aretz than Yosef. You could, any Jewish billionaire you want to point to, no one had it, but Yosef was, for all intents and purposes, the king, other than Paro. Yet he said, take me out of here, and God will take you out. Where? To Eretz Yisrael. This is Yosef's final message. And really, at the end of the day, that's all that matters. So, as the Rav said last week, and I'm repeating, I will leave it to you to decide what the proper course of action is. Rabbi Say, Shabbos Makar HaBracha, make it a wonderful Shabbos and enjoy the ta'anugim, the spiritual uplift, but realize that our bracha ultimately comes from our Shmira Shabbos. We should be Zaychazan to see all of Am Yisrael come home to Eretz Yisrael, and together we will rebuild Bayit Shlishi. B'meir v'yameinu. Shabbat Shalom.